Donald Trump's return to the presidency of the United States and his unwavering support for Israel have sparked great interest among scholars of biblical eschatology. Many believe that these events could have a decisive influence on the future of Israel and favor the process of rebuilding its temple in Jerusalem. During his first term, Trump expressed clear and unconditional support for Israel, officially recognizing Jerusalem as its capital, a gesture that strengthened the Jewish nation's international standing. He also defended Israel's right to protect itself and strengthened military ties with the country. His administration pushed through strategic agreements, such as the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab countries. This continued support from the United States under Trump's leadership has not only strengthened Israel's security and stability, but according to some, could accelerate prophetic plans related to the temple in Jerusalem. On the other hand, it is important to highlight that in 2024, Mar-a-Lago became a key center of international political activity. During the Conservative Political Action Conference, Trump strengthened his relations with Argentine President Javier Milei and businessman Elon Musk, setting a new dynamic in United States foreign policy. Like Trump, Milei has expressed unconditional support for Israel and has backed the construction of the Third Temple. Now, it is essential to remember that historically, Israel had two temples. The first temple was built in the 10th century before Christ by King Solomon. Erected on Mount Moriah as the sacred place of worship where the Ark of the Covenant was housed and the religious life of Israel was concentrated. However, this majestic temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 before Christ, marking the beginning of the exile and a milestone in the transformation of Jewish identity. Following the return from exile, construction of the Second Temple began, which was completed in 516 before Christ and resumed its role as a spiritual and cultural center for the people. This temple, later renovated and significantly expanded by Herod the Great, stood out for its splendor and its importance in religious practices. However, in 70 after Christ, the Jews were living under occupation by the Roman Empire. The Hebrews rebelled against the occupiers, and General Titus ordered the city and the Temple of Jerusalem to be razed, leaving only a wall that is now called the Wailing Wall. There began the first great diaspora of Jews throughout the world. A few years later, in 135 after Christ, there was another rebellion against Rome. The Romans defeated the Jews and forced them to flee en masse. Since then, what is now known as Israel is a territory inhabited by Arabs and, to a lesser extent, Jews. The vast majority of Jews were spread throughout the world, from Byzantium to Rome, via Russia, Spain, and later America. Although they were far from their ancestral homeland, at the heart of their identity and tradition, the longing to return to the land of Israel remained intact, as well as the hope of rebuilding the Third Temple, the central symbol of their faith, and the continuity of their sacred rites. Over the centuries, the Jewish community faced countless episodes of intolerance and violence. During the Middle Ages, in the context of Christianity, the influence of a theology that blamed the Jews for the death of Jesus contributed to the unleashing of persecutions, expulsions, and bloody episodes. Among these, the time of the Crusades and the expulsion from Spain in 1492 are painful examples of how they were forced to leave their homes or undergo forced conversions to avoid martyrdom. This adversity intensified in the 20th century, when the rise of the Nazi regime in Europe led to the implementation of systematic hate policies. The Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews were brutally murdered, represented the culmination of centuries of suffering, leaving deep scars on the collective memory. Despite these hardships and the long exile, the hope of a return to the Promised Land remained alive throughout history, fueled in large part by the desire to rebuild the Third Temple, an ideal that was embodied in Jewish popular prayers and imagination. This sentiment merged with the rise of the Zionist movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which articulated the dream of a national home that would serve as a refuge and end centuries of persecution. Following the devastation of World War II and the horror of the Holocaust, the international community found it imperative to support the creation of a state of their own for the Jewish people. In 1948, the proclamation of the State of Israel marked a historic milestone. The return to the ancestral land became a reality. Closing, albeit in a complex way, and with repercussions that persist to this day. a painful chapter of exile and suffering at the hands of both Catholic powers in medieval times and the Nazi regime in the 20th century. Thus, the establishment of Israel not only meant the recovery of a territory, but also the revival of a millennia-old identity, always accompanied by the ideal of a complete restoration that would include, in a future yet to be defined, the reconstruction of the Third Temple. The aspiration to rebuild the Third Temple remains a central element in the faith and imagination of many Jews, especially among the Orthodox sectors, who see in this project the culmination of ancient prophecies and the fulfillment of a divine mandate. Today, the Temple Institute in Jerusalem embodies this fervor, having spent decades meticulously preparing all the ritual utensils and elements that, according to tradition, will be used in the restored temple, from the seven-branched candelabrum, the menorah, to the objects necessary for sacrifices, including priestly vestments and the protocol of the liturgical service. Training programs have even been developed for priests, and details of temple practices have been meticulously recreated, including the preparation of the red heifer, whose sacrifice plays an essential role in purification rites. However, the longing for the temple faces a complex reality: the historically sacred site, the Temple Mount. It is currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, inextricable symbols of Islam and a source of profound political and religious upheaval. It is important to remember that the arrival of the Muslims in Jerusalem represented a crucial moment in the history of the city, and specifically on the Temple Mount. The Muslim occupation of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem began in the 7th century, following the expansion of Islam in the Near East. In 637 after Christ, Muslim forces under Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab conquered the city of Jerusalem, which at the time belonged to the Byzantine Empire. Upon entering the city, Caliph Omar showed great respect towards the temples and holy places of the three main monotheistic religions. Islamic tradition holds that it was during this period that a deep bond began to be established with the Temple Mount, which in Islam is known as the Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. On the same site where the first and second temples of Jerusalem stood in ancient times, Omar ordered the construction of a small mosque, the Al-Qibli Mosque, in order to symbolize Islam's connection to the holy city. However, construction of the main Islamic structure on the Temple Mount began soon after, in 691 after Christ, with the construction of the Dome of the Rock, under the rule of the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik. This impressive octagonal structure, with its iconic golden dome, it was erected on the sacred rock where, according to Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the event known as the Isra and Miraj. In this account, Muhammad is told of being transported from the Mosque of Mecca to the Far Mosque, which is associated with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, on a nocturnal spiritual journey that culminated in his ascension to heaven. This event is considered one of the most important in the life of the Prophet Muhammad and a pillar of the Islamic faith. The Dome of the Rock should not be confused with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, another Muslim holy site located in the same Temple Mount complex, south of the rock on which the dome stands. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, with its large prayer space, was built around 705 after Christ, also under Caliph Abd al-Malik. The construction of these two structures symbolized not only the supremacy of Islam over Jerusalem, but also the consolidation of the Muslim presence in a city that was claimed by multiple religious traditions. Over the centuries, the Temple Mount has remained a key site for both Muslims and Jews, with the presence of mosques. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which remain pillars of Islamic identity in Jerusalem. The connection between Muhammad and the Temple Mount through the event of Isra and Miraj reinforces the centrality of this place in the Muslim tradition, where the Prophet Muhammad is considered to have left his heavenly mark by ascending to heaven from this location. However, this same Temple Mount also represents an essential symbol in the Jewish religion, since it is considered the place where the ancient temples were erected, which has generated constant conflict and deep political and religious complexity between both communities. This situation causes tensions not only within the Jewish community, where, despite the existence of various currents, the idea of the restoration of the temple remains a central element in the liturgy and in messianic hope, but also on the international level. since any attempt to modify the status quo could unleash conflicts of greater magnitude in a region already marked by historical disputes. In this context, the reconstruction of the Third Temple is a theme that has been interpreted in various ways in Jewish thought, reflecting the complexity and depth of the tradition. For many Orthodox Jews and religious Zionists, the Temple is a divine promise that will materialize with the arrival of the Messiah, who, according to these beliefs, will be the architect responsible for erecting the physical structure on the Temple Mount. This vision is based on biblical prophecies, in which the advent of the Messiah will not only restore the Temple and the ancient rites, but will also reunite the Jewish people and usher in an era of redemption, peace, and universal justice. On the other hand, there are currents within Judaism that interpret the Temple in a more symbolic and spiritual way, understanding that true reconstruction does not necessarily involve erecting a physical building, but rather it is an internal transformation that manifests itself in the heart and conduct of each individual through prayer, the study of the Torah, and the practice of justice. From this perspective, the Temple is seen as a state of intimate and permanent connection with the divine, in which sacred space is reinterpreted as one's own soul and community, transcending material limitations. Other voices within modern Judaism are cautious about the idea of rebuilding the Temple, given the political situation and interfaith tensions in Jerusalem. For many of these thinkers, the longing for a temple must be interpreted metaphorically, as a symbol of redemption and the perfection of human relations with God, rather than a literal mandate to build another temple on the same physical site. In this sense, the Third Temple would not be as relevant as the promotion of peace and justice in the world, and approaches that promote unity and understanding among peoples are preferred, without necessarily resorting to the reconstruction of a building that causes divisions. Now, after having analyzed all this, let us see what the Bible reveals to us about the Third Temple in Jerusalem. The Bible mentions that some end-time events will occur in a temple in Jerusalem. Let's start by considering what it says in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. For 1 week, that ruler will make a covenant with many, but in the middle of the week he will put an end to sacrifices and offerings. And in the temple, he will establish the abomination that causes destruction, until the disastrous end that has been decreed for it comes about. Note that as the second part of this week begins, a coming ruler will put an end to sacrifices and offerings, implying that the Jewish temple will be operational again. In Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, we also read, "Then there was given to me a reed like a measuring rod, and I was told, 'Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But the court which is outside the temple leave out, and do not measure it. For it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city underfoot for 42 months. If we consider that the book of Revelation was written around 90 after Christ, and that the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 after Christ, we must necessarily assume that the temple which John saw in his vision, and which was to be measured, was in reality a new temple. Now, thinking that the Jews could rebuild their temple in Jerusalem seems like an unattainable idea today. It is true that many Orthodox Jews long for this possibility, but the place is occupied by the Dome of the Rock, which, according to Muslim tradition, it is the site from which Muhammad ascended to heaven and is therefore considered the third holiest place in the Islamic world. Now, under Muslim control, it is inconceivable to imagine that the Israelites could seize it to build their temple there in the current political climate. Recently, some Jewish scholars have investigated the exact location of the ancient temple and concluded that it was located just north of the Dome of the Rock, in an area where, in theory, its reconstruction would be possible. According to these studies, the temple atrium would coincide with the current location of the Dome of the Rock, which seems to agree with what our text in Revelation indicates, which indicates that the outer court of the temple was to be set aside because it had been given to the Gentiles. This idea is interesting, although there is still no certainty about it. How the Israelites will be able to rebuild their temple on that site is a mystery. Some hold that this will occur under the auspices and protection of the Antichrist himself. In any case, this passage clearly indicates to us that a temple will once again exist in Jerusalem, and other fragments of Scripture indicate that the Antichrist will sit there as if he were God, will cease the sacrifices, will desecrate the sanctuary, and will demand sacrifices for himself. The rebuilding of the temple is likely to spark a great deal of interest in spiritual life in Israel. Indeed, John was tasked not only with measuring the temple, but also with the worshippers. Who might these be? We do not know for sure, but they may symbolize the future remnant of Israel who will worship God in the restored temple. In this sense, the act of measuring them could be interpreted as a way of identifying how many there are and who belongs to that community. A contrast is thus established between those who worship God in his temple and those who in the future will be shown worshiping the beast. God measures his worshippers to recognize his own, while later the beast will do something similar to mark his own. Perhaps we should associate this action of measuring the worshippers with the sealing of the 144,000 Israelites mentioned in Revelation chapter 7, verse 4. On the other hand, regarding the order to measure the temple, it is curious that after carrying out the measurement, John does not offer us any quantitative data. This suggests that the purpose of this divine instruction must have been different. Perhaps God intended to evaluate the state of the building and the activities taking place there, or perhaps he intended to mark the temple to preserve it from his judgments. In this last case, God would be recognizing as his own that which was measured and would commit to protecting it. On the other hand, regarding the order to measure the temple, it is curious that after doing so, John does not provide us with any statistical data. Therefore, the purpose of this divine order must have been another. Perhaps God wanted to check the state of the construction of the temple and what was being done there, or he had the purpose of marking it to preserve it before his judgments. In this last case, God would be recognizing as his own that which had been a means and would commit to taking care of it. This last idea would be confirmed by a similar passage found in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. He also had a vision in which he was commanded to measure the temple in Jerusalem, and it is significant that after doing so, the glory of God filled the temple and established the place of his throne there. Now let us note a very significant detail that we find in John's vision. But the court which is outside the temple leave out, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will trample the holy city underfoot for 42 months. In Herod's ancient temple, there was an outer courtyard designated as a place of prayer for the Gentiles, and this is probably the same courtyard referred to in John's prohibition. The expression "set it aside" suggests a rejection by God of that outer area. In line with the idea we have just presented, God did not consider that section as part of what was his. Since it was outside the measured area, so it was not sacred but profane. And the reason was because it had been given to the Gentiles, that is, to those who were not Jews, and it was going to be trampled by them. Now, after studying all these passages, it is clear that Israel will build its third temple in Jerusalem in the future. However, the question that arises is, how will they accomplish such a feat? Within the current discourse on the reconstruction of the Third Temple, there are voices in the Muslim world that maintain that, under current conditions, handing over control of the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, to the Jews is unthinkable. According to this position, only a catastrophic event, like a major earthquake that shakes and irreparably damages the sacred structure, it could force a change in the status quo. This argument underlines the determination with which Muslims defend their religious and cultural heritage, considering the site, which houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, to be sacred and unbreakable. In this way, the notion that only a catastrophic event could lead to the ceding of control of the site is presented more as an expression of principle than as a realistic projection of a change in the administration of the Temple Mount. However, some Bible scholars have raised the possibility that before or after the rapture, a major earthquake will occur that will destroy the Dome of the Rock, thus making it easier for the Jews to build their third temple. On the other hand, some eschatology scholars suggest that the Antichrist will confirm the Abraham Accords, a process that began in 2020 and has marked a turning point in Middle East politics. Over the course of more than 70 years, the position of Arab countries towards Israel has been evolving within the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. As Giulietta Espin, professor of international relations at the European University, points out, the greatest rapprochement between the two parties occurred in 2020, when 4 Arab countries and Israel signed the Abraham Accords with the aim of normalizing their relations. In addition to Israel, the countries that established diplomatic relations in this process were United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. These agreements were promoted and overseen by the USA administration, then led by President Donald Trump. They were named the Abraham Accords in reference to the importance of Abraham as a central figure in the 3 great monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Now, what do the Abraham Accords include? The Accords were bilateral negotiations, meaning that Israel signed an individual pact with each country rather than a joint multilateral agreement. Through these treaties, the signatory countries recognize Israel as a sovereign state and establish official diplomatic relations. Initiatives are currently being explored to expand the Abraham Accords, an effort known as the 2.0 Abraham Accords. This strategy seeks to strengthen diplomatic and strategic alliances, with the aim of consolidating a more stable and peaceful Middle East. Countries such as Saudi Arabia and Oman are being considered to join this initiative, which could significantly transform the geopolitical dynamics of the region. In an interview in 2024, Donald Trump reaffirmed his commitment to expanding the Abraham Accords if he returned to the presidency, calling them an absolute priority of his administration. Trump suggested that within a year, a broad coalition of Middle Eastern nations could join these agreements, with the aim of normalizing relations between Israel and Arab countries. Now that Trump is back in the USA presidency, there is great expectation about the resumption and expansion of the Abraham Accords. It is not known for certain how many Arab countries might join this process of reconciliation with Israel. However, some Bible prophecy scholars suggest that it will ultimately be the Antichrist who will confirm and consolidate these agreements with many nations, since in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, the following is mentioned, "And he will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." Another version translates this passage as follows, "For 1 more week that wicked king will make a pact with a large number of people." If this interpretation is correct, this could mean that the Abraham Accords could evolve into a larger covenant, sponsored by the Antichrist. This in turn would open the way for Israel to build its 3rd temple. Since, as has been considered in previous videos, today the Jews do not recognize Jesus as their Messiah. Therefore, they remain waiting for their own Messiah, whom we identify as the Antichrist, because it is believed that he will deceive them and be accepted by them. Let us remember what Jesus mentioned about this matter in John chapter 5, verse 43. "I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him." When the Apostle Paul spoke about the coming of the Antichrist, he expounded the same principle. Let us read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 8 to 12, "And then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming, whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, so that they might be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe a lie, in order that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth, but have delighted in unrighteousness." The consequences of refusing to believe in Christ are terrible, as the person exposes himself to being enveloped in the deceptive power of lies. And as Paul explains, this will come to a head when the Antichrist appears. It is incomprehensible that people would reject the true Christ and the works he did in the name of his Father. But instead they will welcome the Antichrist when he comes in his own name and seeking his own glory. This should not surprise us, because it has been like this throughout history. The Old Testament shows us again and again the inclination that the Jews had to believe in false prophets and teachers. At the same time, they rejected the authentic prophets sent by God. These false prophets who lead into error are followed by many, to to the point that sometimes they manage to get people to hand over everything they have. Now, it is difficult to imagine how the Antichrist will persuade the Muslims to give up the site currently occupied by the Dome of the Rock, thus allowing their Jewish neighbors, traditionally at odds, to build their temple there. However, as we approach the end of time, we will continue to see increased preparations to ensure the rebuilding of the temple. Dear listeners, we cannot indulge in speculation or state with certainty how events will unfold, but we must be attentive to prophetic events. As believers, we must not overlook what is happening in the Middle East, especially in Israel. It is important that we pay attention to the repercussions that the Donald Trump administration will have in relation to Israel. With Trump in office, his relationship with Israel will be key, and we cannot help but wonder, what role will he play in the prophetic scenario? What achievements will he attain? What conflicts will arise? History has taught us that leaders can be instruments for the fulfillment of divine purposes, but in the end, it is God who has absolute control of all things. We know that Christ is coming soon, and current events seem to be setting the stage for the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Therefore, now more than ever, it is time to seek God, strengthen our faith, and remain in constant prayer. Let us pray for the nations, for Israel, and above all, for the salvation of souls. So we come to the end of this video. Don't forget to share this message and subscribe to continue analyzing prophetic times together. See you in the next video. God bless you.